Inside every one of us sits about 3.16 billion base pairs of DNA. And that code doesn't just build your body, it keeps records. It carries the memory of where your ancestors came from, what they survived, and sometimes the darkest things that ever happened to them. And according to a set of genetic studies, buried in that code is the ghost of something extraordinary. Evidence that a few thousand years ago, much of the known world may have gone through a spasm of violence so severe that its fingerprint is still on our DNA today. It's a story almost nobody knows, and in one sense, it might be the closest thing to a First World War that humanity ever experienced. Not because armies marched across the globe, but because the same brutal pattern shows up across Europe, Asia, the Middle East and Africa all at once. Now, I want to be careful and honest with you as we go, because the popular version of this story runs way ahead of the evidence. But even the careful version is genuinely one of the strangest mysteries in human prehistory. So let's walk through it properly. It starts with a clue in the genome. When researchers analysed the DNA of modern populations, they found the signature of what's called a bottleneck. A bottleneck is what happens when a population crashes. Numbers plummet, and with them, genetic diversity. That's not rare in nature. Humans have been through several, including a famous deadly one around 900,000 years ago, caused by nothing more than a harsh, unforgiving climate. But this one was different. This one was recent, the late Neolithic, just a few thousand years ago, and it looked like it might have been our own doing. And here's the part that makes it so bizarre. The crash showed up almost entirely in the Y chromosome, the piece of DNA passed from father to son, carried only by men. But in mitochondrial DNA, the part passed down through mothers, there was no matching collapse at all. So whatever happened hammered the male line while leaving the female line largely intact. And the numbers, if you read them at face value, are staggering. At the low point, the effective male population appears to have fallen to something like 1/20th of what it had been, a female-to-male ratio of roughly 17:1. Now, that number, 17:1, a 95% collapse, is where I have to pump the brakes, because it's the most misunderstood figure in this whole story. This is not a body count. It doesn't mean 95% of men were killed in a war. Effective population size is a geneticist's measure of how many individuals actually passed their lineage forward. So this figure is really telling us that the vast majority of male lineages died out, that a small number of men's descendants came to dominate, while most other male lines simply vanished from the record. That's a very different thing from a battlefield, and hold on to that distinction because it's the key to the whole mystery. Still, something clearly happened that hit men and not women. And the first explanation researchers reached for was violence. Because if the cause had been a volcano, a plague, a climate disaster, you'd expect it to fall roughly equally on both sexes. A collapse that targets one sex points to something social, something human. And when you go looking for corpses, they are not hard to find. We've uncovered well over 250 late Neolithic sites in Europe alone where violent death occurred. This period is notorious for it. Neolithic skeletons turn up in grim condition far more often than the humans before or after them. One analysis of more than 2,300 early farmers found over 10% of both men and women bearing injuries from weapons, likely from raids over crops and livestock. Another study of 138 individuals in Spain found nearly a quarter showed signs of violence, and adolescent and adult males made up the overwhelming majority of them. And these numbers are almost certainly undercounts, because most fatal attacks leave no trace on bone at all. Only about 15% of killing blows from sharp weapons mark the skeleton. The rest are invisible to us, to say nothing of deaths from the disease and starvation that follow war. And it wasn't just scattered killings. Two things became horrifyingly common in this era: battles and massacres. Let me take you to a few sites, because they tell the story better than any statistic. In Germany, there's the Talheim death pit, dated to around 5000 BC. The remains of at least 34 people brutally killed, and not one of them shows defensive wounds, which means they weren't fighting back. They were fleeing. The killing blows sort into just three types: the sharp edge of an adze-like tool, the blunt side of it, and arrows. Nearly every skull bore a lethal head wound. Among the dead were 16 children, 9 adult men, and 7 older women. But the younger women were missing. And that absence is a recurring, chilling theme at these sites. The strong implication is that they were taken, carried off by the attackers. Not far away, in Austria, the massacre at and Schletz was deadlier still. Around 200 victims dumped in a mass grave after a raid. Again, a glaring absence of young women among the dead. But this one added something darker. Many bodies were missing limbs, and skulls were found separated from them, signs of possible dismemberment. Different attackers, it seems, had different rituals. And then there's the worst of them. Herxheim in Germany, dated to somewhere between 5300 and 4950 BC, the largest known prehistoric mass grave. But here's the twist. Archaeologists don't think Herxheim was a slaughtered village. They think it was the home of the slaughterers. Outside their settlement, they dug at least 80 pits and filled them with the remains of over 1,000 people, possibly 1,500, from newborns to the elderly. Scaled to today's population, it would be like a single town digging a grave for over 800,000 bodies right outside its walls. And nearly every victim was processed the same way: bones broken, skulls cleaved down the middle, and seemingly defleshed. So many skulls were treated this way that researchers believe these people were a kind of skull cult. There's evidence the bodies were cooked, some apparently spit roasted, that bones were cracked for marrow, and, grimly, that certain body parts show preferential biting, suggesting cannibalism with favoured cuts. Bones were fashioned into cups and ornaments, some found on spikes near the entrance, and they had reach. The victims of Herxheim came from wildly different cultures and lifestyles: hunter-gatherers and farmers, highlanders and lowlanders, some from as far as 300 miles away. Which means these people ran organised, long-distance raids requiring real logistics, from a settlement that itself held fewer than 50 people. Impressive in the most disturbing way imaginable. And there's a final mystery. Within about 50 years of the killings, Herxheim was abandoned. Some wonder whether someone finally came for revenge. That's the world these skeletons describe, and in it, simply surviving as a young man was an achievement. Life expectancy in this period sat somewhere between 20 and 33 years. Even if you made it to 15, you weren't expected to see 35. It ties for the youngest modern humans have ever tended to die. So, what on earth was going on? Why did so much of the inhabited world seem locked in this cycle of killing? There isn't one clean answer, but there are strong ideas, and ironically, the leading one blames our greatest success. Just before all this, humanity went through the Neolithic revolution. the invention of farming. People settled down, populations boomed, villages rose. Wonderful on paper. But that same success handed us the tools for organized violence. Settled groups could muster fighters, stockpile weapons, and, crucially, it created something worth fighting over. A farm was food, loot, and people, all concentrated in one place. Your neighbor was no longer a distant band. They were a permanent settlement next door, a rival, maybe a threat. And so, the thinking goes, all neighbors are dangerous became a survival instinct. There's a more specific version that tries to explain the male-only collapse. As farming spread, societies reorganized into patrilineal clans, kin groups of related men, because in an untrusting world, you relied on blood. Women moved between groups, men stayed put. That made Y chromosome lineages fragile. When one clan wiped out another, or when a clan simply died out, whole male lines vanished at once, while the female lines, flowing between groups, survived. Wage that war across a continent for generations, and you get a lopsided genetic crash. But, and this is the honest heart of the matter, a lot of scientists now think you might not need the war at all. A 2024 study proposed a peaceful explanation, and it's compelling. In these patrilineal systems, clans regularly split apart in a process called lineal fission. Because each new clan was founded by a handful of closely related men, most of their Y chromosome diversity was already narrow. And over generations, through nothing more than luck and differing reproductive success, some lineages exploded, while most quietly faded away. No massacre required, just social structure, chance, and time doing the work. The violence in the skeletons was absolutely real, but it may not be the thing that carved this signature into our DNA. The likeliest truth is probably a blend. Peaceful social forces and real violence working together to grind the male lineages down. Either way, the mark is undeniable, and it lingers. Some populations, like Central Asian groups, still haven't fully recovered their Y chromosome diversity to this day. So how did it all end? Well, it didn't, not cleanly. In raw numbers, wars grew deadlier over time as technology advanced. We simply grew faster than we died. It wasn't really until the last century or so that the number of new conflicts began a steady decline. Which is a strange thing to sit with, because it means that despite everything on the news, we are living in one of the most peaceful chapters our species has ever known. And you can read that peace in our lifespans, over 3 times what a Neolithic farmer could expect. We've got our own problems, no question, but I, for one, am quietly grateful that skull cults and shin takers aren't among them. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep looking up.